Oh, hello. Hope you're doing well today. This is part two in a painting tutorial that I started with this kind of this Milky Way sky, kind of a deep night sky with this kind of Milky Way burst of light that kind of comes through. So today I'm going to show you how to kind of finish the bottom section. I'm going to create a mountain landscape that this Milky Way is existing in. And then I'm also going to show you how I like to think about creating stars. I'm going to be using this guy, which is essentially a number 8 round watercolor brush. And I will also be using, I'm looking for it on my table here, my fine liner brush. And this fine liner has been through the ringer. I've used it for years and years. See, I've modified it so that it fits nicely in my hand. But yeah, this is a good one. And then the other thing I'm going to use, which might surprise you, is a jelly roll, a uniball. Uh, this guy with white. This is really helpful for creating some of those stars. So you'll see that in a few minutes. All right, let's get started. See, I've got my palette here. Favorite palette, plate, white plate from the thrift store. Generally where I get them. So this guy, I leave my paints on there so that if because I can always, with watercolors, a really nice thing is I can reuse any of this. I just have to re-wet it. It'll be ready to go. So for my mountains, I'm going to mix up today a kind of a purple, kind of a dark purple. So I'm going to use some blue, some of this kind of purple color here. And I need to make it reasonably dark to start because my sky is dark and I want to make sure that um, I'm starting with the kind of the correct color for my mountains. So I brought some blue in there, bringing back some more of this, I guess you might call it a magenta. Um, and now I'm going to touch this black over here. Want to involve some black in this. That's going to kind of get it to that dark shade that I want. And I feel okay about this. So the one thing I am going to do, because I see this is kind of a large section, this piece of paper, just so you know, is 6 inches by 8 inches. And I can tell from this little pool that I'm going to need more watercolor. So I'm just going to I use my brush just to kind of bring some water over to this space. And I'm just going to kind of enlarge this pool. So I'm going to do the same thing I just did, add these same colors until I get back to that dark color that I had, just a larger pool of color. All right, so I feel pretty good about that. The last thing I'm going to do before I begin painting is I just want to think about, I want some highlights just above the mountains that I'm creating. So I'm kind of thinking about that. In fact, I'm going to start, normally I would start kind of from this side and paint all the way across. But for the purposes of this, because I want a mountain that has some of these highlights right above it, I'm just going to kind of start in the center. So I'm going to create kind of a mountain shape that I feel like sits just below that light. And I'm going to continue this guy. I'm actually going to make this side a little bit taller. And I'm working right now, so the way that I'm going to work, and you'll see it in just a second, is I'm going to follow what I would call my wet edge. So the bottom edge of where I've just painted is a wet edge. You want to kind of race that, and what I mean when I say race that is you don't want to allow that to dry um, before you finish painting the entire section that you're painting. So I just keep coming back, and what I'm kind of getting at is you just want to work from that wet edge all the way down. Sometimes people would jump down to the bottom and work their way up, and I am going to paint all the way down from that top layer of mountains that I've made there. The reason for doing that, if you've seen any of my other watercolor mountain landscape tutorials, is I want the next layers that I paint to not have any kind of color discrepancy behind them. So if I was to stop here, and when I paint the darker layers, I might end up with sort of a line that comes through the middle of that mountain section. So just filling in that whole bottom section, and you can see it was good that I added more paint before I began this little section of fill. All right. Okay, I feel pretty good about that. I'm looking now, so I'm kind of leaning back in my chair and I'm looking at this paper to see how wet it is. You can see the way the light comes across it, how wet the paper is when you're working on it in this way. I see that this top edge here is still relatively wet. So I'm gonna mix up another color and see how wet it is after that, and then I might just use the hairdryer real quick to kind of be ready to move on to the next step. So for my next color, it's not really a next color, it's kind of the same color. I'm gonna mix up again a decent amount of water to kind of work from my pool of pigment that I'm gonna create. I'm gonna use that purple again to kind of get this started. And I'm gonna come back to that really dark blue over here. I want, generally, as I'm doing these layers, I want them to get darker and darker, and that's going to help our viewer perceive depth, perceive that these mountains are getting closer and closer. So adding that darkness to these generally. And I think the main reason for that, especially with mountains like this, is atmosphere. So the more atmosphere that is between the viewer and the mountains that are further away, the more hazy they'll be. So I'm just going to use a hairdryer for just a second. And yeah, all right. Some of you watching might say, why didn't this guy expedite that or mute it? I'm not super technically savvy, so sorry. That's just what you'll get. Gonna create another layer here. Got a nicely dried section of paper. I'm gonna end up probably creating across this whole base. I bet I'll do 4, maybe 5 layers of mountains, just because again, the sky is very visually interesting, but these layers of mountains will also kind of continue to make this piece visually interesting. So the main thing to do when you're painting these next layers is be real conscious of not kind of creating the exact same layer that you've already created. One of the ways I like to do that is, so if this guy started by coming down, then I'm going to maybe kind of bring this guy up. But again, I just want to notice, like, if I bring it up, maybe I'll create that layer again. So just want to think a little bit about those before I get started. So this is how I'm going to do that. A lot of times, and I talk about this a lot with students, if I was wanting to be real serious about this painting, not that I'm not being serious about it, but if I wanted it to be maybe more realistic than what I'm going for right now, I would study an image. So I would find an image that I like. I might find a couple of images. So I might find an image of mountains at night, and then I might find an image of the Milky Way. I've made this painting several times now. I've made mountain landscape paintings hundreds of times, I would say. So I'm kind of at a place where I don't need to. I kind of know the lay of the land. I know the tricks of the trade. So I'm not studying an image for this painting, but I recommend that. And again, you can see I'm doing that same thing. I'm painting from the wet edge, and I'm painting all the way down on my piece of paper here. All right, feel pretty good about that. Gonna mix up some more color. You'll notice that as you move your way down, and this should not come as a surprise, but as you move your way down, you'll not have to mix up as large a pool of color before you begin these little segments. The other thing that we'll notice as we get further and further down is we'll use more black. So I'm going to continue to use the colors that I've been using to kind of mix up my base color, but I'm going to start to bring more black into each next section, I would say. So I'm going to do that right now. It's still also relatively wet. By that I mean I'm using, at this point in the painting, I'm using more water in my painting, the paint that I'm using than I am paint. With watercolors, that's kind of important. So I've got my color mixed up. I'm ready to paint my next layer. I'm just going to look. So I'm kind of leaning back on my chair and I'm glancing at the way the light hits this paper. And it's still very wet. So if this is not dry and I touch paint to it, it's going to bleed out and I won't get a distinct new layer. So just want to be real conscious of that. So I'm going to dry this section again, and you can mute your computer if it bothers your ears. I apologize. All right. Gonna paint my next segment. Gonna give maybe a slightly bigger gap, and I'm just kind of visualizing how I want to make this before I start. I think so. These guys have kind of gone up and down and up and down, and this one kind of the same. For this guy, I think I'm just gonna kind of have it come almost diagonally across with some mountain shapes in there. So yeah, let's get started. This paper, again, I mentioned it earlier. So this is 140 pound, 140 pound cold press watercolor paper. And it's a decent paper. It's made. It's made by Canson, which is they're a good brand for making watercolor paper. But I don't know if you can tell. Yeah, it's probably hard to tell from where you are, but this paper is warping. Which is very common with watercolor paper. There are a couple of ways you can kind of combat that. Generally, I go for the easiest way, which is I don't use 140 pound paper. I use 300 pound, so that would take care of a lot of the warping if you use a heavier weight paper. The other thing that some artists will do, I think the artists who really paint a lot of watercolors and they're kind of saving their expense a little bit because 300 pound paper is pretty expensive. What they do is they'll wet the paper beforehand. So they'll soak it and they'll kind of stretch it like a canvas. Because paper, if it's a decent watercolor paper, if you were to look at the ingredients, the main ingredient is cotton. So it's kind of a cotton-based thing. So if you kind of have that in mind, you can kind of stretch it and pull it, and then that kind of prepares the paper so that when you wet it again, it's already stretched. It won't go through this kind of warping. Before I use my dryer, I'm going to mix up my next color. A little bit more of that purplish color. If any of you are curious, I'm using Shinhan. I guess they call them their professional watercolors. Well, that's funny. The tube was already out. The only tube in the container, and it was already out. It was just ready for me to use it. So, as I was saying, these are Shinhan professional watercolors. These small tubes. It's not super expensive. They're pretty nice set of watercolors. So. All right, gonna mix up my next color. Don't need quite as much pigment or as much water. I'll need more pigment. And as I said before, I'm going to make sure that I'm adding more black to these next layers. All right, so I'm going to bring, I've decided now, so I've got 3 layers of watercolor. I haven't, so I'm just looking. It's important to always remember this. This whole little section right here is still really wet, so I need to dry that before I bring any other layers. What I was saying, what I was getting ready to say is, I've got 3 layers of mountain. I'm going to create 2 more. So I'm going to bring this next one kind of at a different angle, just kind of visualizing the piece, and then I'll bring in a smaller section that will have some trees in it. But before I do that, I'm going to dry. Not too bad. Ready to go. All right, so for this section that I said I'm going to bring kind of across in this direction, I want to make sure that I'm kind of still creating that visual effect of it getting closer. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'll show you. So I'm just going to kind of rough up the edge of what these mountains would look like. So by roughing up the edge, I'm just using kind of the point of this, still using that number 8 brush. And I'm just, you can see, because I'm using the point, it's creating kind of a rough texture on the top edge of that mountain. And that rough texture gives us the illusion of, oh, there are trees on that mountain. I see them. Which should be the case. As the mountains get closer, we should be able to see more of those details that would be treetops. So let's see, I've kind of roughed in that section, and now I'm going to do the same thing that I've been doing. I'm just going to paint this bottom edge all the way down to the bottom of my piece of paper. This so some of you might feel like this is very dark, and you might even be wondering, like, can we get another layer of mountains on that? And the answer is yes, we can. And the way that I'm going to do that is the next layer of color that I'm going to mix up, I'm going to make sure is mostly black. And you'll kind of see how that will work. All right, so I'm just noticing here that there's kind of a line that separates this space from the space below, so I'm just going to kind of dab in some color there. All right, feel okay about that? Yep, I'm looking at it on my screen because sometimes it gives you a different perspective. I'm going to mix up my next color. I'm going to use just a tiny little bit of this blue, just a tiny little bit of this purple. And now I need a decent amount of the black, because as I said, I want this last section to be really nicely black. I'm going to paint some tiny trees in here too, so I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. You'll want to get your fine liner brush ready for that. Before I do that, I'm going to dry this section. so again, I'm going to create kind of that rough texture and varying it from the mountain before. So at this point right here, I'm going to turn this, and when I say turn it, I'm just going to bring that mountain down just a little bit. It's definitely okay to have some parts of this rough edge stand up more than the others. And now I just want to make sure that I've got enough of this black to kind of fill in the rest of this bottom. And I feel pretty good about that. Gonna go for my fine liner brush now. And I'm gonna wet it and just kind of touch it straight into this black over here. And here's how I like to paint some small trees, some happy little trees, if you will. I'm gonna start by painting the trunk, the center part of the tree. And I'm just gonna dab, you can see I'm just gonna kind of touch some more black on either side. And I'm just filling in what I would call kind of an imaginary triangle. I want to leave some gaps. Those gaps are important. Those gaps are, when we look at trees, we don't see a solid clunk of plant. We see the gaps between the leaves and the branches. So I'm creating another one here. Same technique. When I paint these trees, I don't generally paint trees like an oak or something that is not triangular kind of in shape. I almost always paint some evergreens, and my thinking there with that is these are more uh, visually. This is kind of we recognize these more. If I was to paint a round oak shape, it would generally blend in with some of these others, or it might kind of seem as odd. So I've got 3 there. I think I'm going to put maybe 1 or 2 more over here. Also want to be conscious of making sure that these little trees that you create come all the way down into the layer of mountain that you've just made. If they don't, they'll seem strange. They should not stand clearly above the rest of the trees. That would be like they were growing out of, off the top of a tree that is below them. These trees, if we were in this actual place that we're creating, they would extend all the way, much further down into the kind of the segment that's down below. All right, feeling like this video has gotten pretty long, so I'm going to stop here, and I'll create another video where I show you kind of how to do the stars in the top section. So thanks for watching, and I'll get you the last part of this real soon. All right.